Hey everyone, my name is Ben Heisch. I am a wedding and elopement photographer, and today we're talking about what might be considered the holy grail of premium compact film cameras, and that is the Contax T2. Now, the Contax T2 is a legendary camera that has more recently gotten into even more of sort of a cult following among young hipsters and people who follow Kardashians. But there is a really good reason why it actually is an amazing camera and why all the hype around it really has made it one of the most desirable point and shoots out there. So as with almost any camera, the thing that really makes this camera sing is this incredible 38 f2.8 lens. It's made by Carl Zeiss, and it is the Sonar design, and anybody that knows anything about lenses knows that Zeiss makes incredible optics, and the fact that they can pack such an amazing lens into such a small little space is quite impressive. The lens renders really well, and when I say that, I'm being really straightforward in the fact that I have the Zeiss Distagon 35 1.4 for the Leica system. Obviously, there's a huge difference overall in both size, weight, everything like that. And yeah, the Distagon is $2,200, I think. And so it's gonna blow this thing out of the water. But if I'm photographing these two cameras kind of in tandem, most of the time, especially if I'm doing any sort of travel work or anything that isn't clearly gonna be shot at 1.4, I'm usually gonna have to look through the photos with a pretty close eye to see if maybe I changed lens or something like that right off the bat to even notice the difference between the two lenses. Now, I'm not saying that this little point and shoot is really going to rival, a $2,200 Leica M-mount Zeiss lens. But what I am saying is from a smaller standpoint, when you're just kind of browsing through the images and stuff like that, unless you start to zoom in or you see a lot of out of focus elements or something like that, it really is hard to tell them apart. And in that, what I mean specifically is the micro contrast and the sharpness that I get out of this little guy is amazing. So if you're gonna talk about this lens, one of the things you're going to have to do is talk about the fact that it goes down to f2.8. And if anybody watched my video on the Fujifilm Class W, we talked about that a lot, about how amazing it is that such a small compact camera can have such a fast aperture. I mean, look at how small this lens is, and you're able to get a 38 2.8 out of it. I think my biggest disappointment, other than the fact that these are super expensive, out of this entire camera though, is the fact that the 2.8 setting is also the auto setting. So I can manually choose f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, but if I choose f2.8, it's not going to actually let me use that aperture unless the camera doesn't have enough light to use any of the other ones. So the only way you can photograph this at f2.8 is in lower light situations, or if you're using a high-speed film, or you're kind of working with the limits of the camera to force it down, because the f2.8 again is the auto setting. In terms of choosing that f2.8 aperture, I think that's one of the biggest advantages that this Class W and the Class S have over this Contax T2 is the fact that I can choose f2.8 at any time and also have a P mode to move to auto. Now I understand why they did this though. On any camera, the lower your f-stop, the less things are gonna be in focus and the more of a chance that your camera is going to have to miss focus. And so on a camera that is a premium camera that, maybe a lot of people that have a lot of money that aren't necessarily great at photography because they're buying a point and shoot, If they're shooting it at the f2.8 setting all the time, you know, maybe they're misfocusing and stuff like that, and they're gonna get back a lot of film that is going to be out of focus. So I think what, maybe I could be wrong, but I think what Contax was doing in this is just making the 2.8 feature be the auto mode so that, you know, they kind of use the 2.8 as a last resort. But as someone who, like myself, is serious about photography, knows a lot about photography, I really, really wish they would have allowed that setting as the same thing that the Class series does, to have a P mode and then every aperture available. So as we're talking about the lens, we might as well talk about the flash, because those settings are on here too. There's 2 flash settings, and I really do love how everything's kind of incorporated on here. It makes it really, really easy. So in this, you have the flash off settings, which are any of these numbers here. So your camera defaults to flash off. There is no way to auto use the flash. It's either you decide you want the flash or you decide you don't want the flash. I'm kind of 50-50 on this. I do like it, but there are times where I don't want to think at all. It would be nice to have. But you have the kind of pre-flash, so the double flash that gives a pre-flash, and then the regular to reduce red eye. And then you just have the singular flash, which is the thing that I do most of the time, because I can fix the red eye in post if I need to. And the flash going off takes a little bit longer, the battery drains faster, all that stuff. So I usually kind of skip that pre-flash, but almost always use the single flash. And I do find that the flash is pretty good, pretty even, and does a really good job of both lighting the scene and giving me an even exposure. So yeah, it's a great look. Moving from the lens into just about the only thing on this camera that you can even change anyway, I love, 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 love this focusing wheel. So to turn the camera on and off, you simply move this from off to autofocus. And then the coolest thing is that the next setting right here is infinity. So I'm very rarely ever using any of the other settings, but I flip between autofocus, infinity, and then just the on-off all the time. I find that these focusing systems in some of these older point and shoot cameras and stuff like that have a really hard time, you know, seeing through things, especially windows, or if you're on an airplane or anything like that. It's really, really easy to just click it to infinity and make sure that you know, if you're shooting something in infinity, a landscape, something like that, there's not going to be some reason for your camera to mess up and, front focus on something else. When I first got this camera, I didn't really realize, and there was a ton of frames where I was just actually trying to point at the distance, take a photo, and I was missing focus, and it was focusing on something else in the foreground. And it got really frustrating until I realized that I should just use this infinity setting. And it has given me some amazing photos, especially just knowing that I'm telling the camera, listen, I'm photographing some mountain back there, or photographing some clouds out the window on a plane, or anything like that. I just find that system and that setup to be really, really helpful. And another thing that I do when I'm photographing weddings actually is I zone focus a lot on the dance floor. And so another really, really great way to do this is you can set your focus to maybe like a meter or 0.7 meters. And then that allows you to just be able to walk around and take photos of people like close up and know that your camera's not gonna be back focusing or way off the bat somewhere else crazy. For me, that's how I walk around and do all my dance flash stuff. And actually, if you are interested in learning more about how I do a lot of the things that I do, I recently set up a Patreon and made a video specifically about how I do all my dance flash stuff. So I'll put a link in the description below if you are interested in basically how I go about using all of this gear that I always talk about. The other feature that this camera has that is very, very, very useful is this exposure compensation dial. There's nothing really amazing about it other than it actually is pretty easy to use, and I've just basically had no issues with it. I found that using a point and shoot camera, I often don't really want to think about a lot of things, but having an exposure compensation is super, super helpful and something I use all the time. Typically I use this camera at anywhere between +0.5 and +1. I found that most often that's just because the way I meter for digital. The way I meter for digital is typically a little bit underexposed to get the most out of my raw files. And so if I, click my camera at about +1, that usually gives me a pretty decent exposure. And we all know that with C41 film, especially, which is what I roll through this most often, it gives me the most flexibility in my negatives. So as you can see, this thing is a tank, and I have dropped it so many times. You can see here on the grip where I scuffed it up and dropped it. There's just all sorts of little things, but this titanium body is just so solid. And I've dropped it from like full standing height before. Was obviously super worried. It's been out. One of the first things I did was take it out on a nature trail. Ended up pouring down rain. I actually got some of my favorite photos ever out of it, but it kind of shut down right afterwards. I was able to just kind of take all the batteries out, take everything out, dry it off, and it worked great. And that's another thing I'll say too. The battery in here lasts for forever. I probably put 4 batteries in this Class W in the same amount of time that I've used this Contax T2. And that's actually really convenient, seeing how I don't always have spare batteries for these little things sitting around, especially if I'm just tossing in my pocket to go to the park with my kid or something. So anyone who's followed these cameras knows that the price has just gone crazy in all these premium compacts. But I will say that this camera definitely is worth the hype. The lens is incredible. The stuff that you get out of it and just the overall build quality, it is so solid. It just feels like when you're gonna pay a stupid amount of money for a point and shoot camera, that it feels like when you pick it up and actually like touch it, it feels like it's worth that price. This camera, on the other hand, looks like it's worth that price, but honestly, it just feels so much more plasticky. The Contax just feels like a tank and something that's gonna last forever. Don't get me wrong, I love the Class W. It might actually be my favorite camera over these two, at least I'm using it more often right now. But it's gonna be really hard for me to ever consider selling this amazing camera. It is by far the camera that I've shot the most rolls with of any film camera that I've ever used in my entire life. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about this camera or about any of these cameras, leave them in the comments below. I would love to just kind of help out and let you know anything that I can about this kind of stuff. And if you wanna learn how I shoot these cameras, use these cameras, any of that kind of stuff, jump on and check out my Patreon. I post multiple videos and articles a month. Multiple of the things we were actually talking about on this video, I've done videos and articles about on that platform. And it's something that I'm really, really excited about using moving forward. So thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.